lecture, we're going to look at an example of a poem that doesn't have a fully formed plot, but definitely has a narrative where we can identify some different turns. So we'll practice doing that. We're going to look at My Father's Song as the example poem in this case. So this poem, there clearly is a story element to it, a narrative, even though it doesn't have a fully formed plot like My Last Duchess. And you can listen to the My Last Duchess example for a poem with all those pieces of plot and a pretty complex plot. In this one, though, the idea, the story to it is simpler. It doesn't have necessarily all those, exposition and inciting incident, all those pieces, but we certainly can talk about the narrative, the story element, and identify the turns and meaning, and then that will help us to get at the significant ways in which this narrative is structured. So if you take a look at this poem, the first stanza, wanting to say things, I miss my father tonight, his voice, the slight catch, the depth from his thin chest, the tremble of emotion in something he has just said to his son, his song. So that's sort of an introductory element, and obviously there's a turn right after that because then it's starting the song. And the next three stanzas are that song, which is a memory that the son has of planting corn with his father, and they find a little mouse, and the father picks it up and moves it, and so it's this good memory that he has of his father that kind of represents to him what his father was like as a man. So those three stanzas are all the song, as it says at the end of the first stanza, and then there's another turn in the very last stanza where it comes back to that current moment that began in stanza 1. I remember the very softness, the cool warm sand, the tiny live mice, and my father saying things. And notice it comes back to the notion of saying things, which was introduced in line 1, wanting to say things, and then my father saying things is how that ends. So there is this kind of parallel, even in the language being used, that brings you back to that moment. But note how that the meaning, how it shifts at the end of the first stanza and then right before the last stanza. And then those three stanzas in the middle are all talking about this one really specific memory. So when we think about it that way, when we analyze the turns in this poem, we actually see that we can kind of break it up into two pieces, and that is the son's voice, and then these three stanzas of his memory where he's telling this specific story about his father, and he kind of represents that as an example of his father's song, right? This memory that he has and the way his father behaved is like this song that for him is a communication, an ongoing communication about, a way of connecting to his father that the speaker of the poem has. So that gives you a sense in a poem, even though it doesn't have a fully formed narrative, there's definitely a story element, a son remembering his father, and then the specific memory itself even has its own kind of narrative strand to it. So we definitely can still talk about narrative meaning, we can talk about turns, and by identifying those things, it helps us to see the structure of the poem and to understand the meaning.